Welcome, everybody. Most of you know me. I'm Jessie Sheslow. I'm the Director of Community Relations at the Federation. On behalf of my colleagues, Andrea Eifert and Giselle Pinchuk, we want to thank you for joining this CRC and Shapiro Teen Engagement Program webinar, Jewish on Campus, What Parents Need to Know, with the Israel Action Network. You all know that the Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee's mission is to strengthen Jewish life and identity in our community, provide for Jewish people in need, and promote support for Israel. We're proud of the programming we've offered since COVID-19 began and are officially moving forward with an all-virtual program season. We know that you, our community, know how difficult of a decision this was, but your safety and the safety of our incredible staff is our % priority. Anti-Semitism has been on the rise for years. According to the Anti-Defamation League, 2019 saw a 12% increase in anti-Jewish hate crimes over 2018. Each year, the numbers rise. After the summer we had here in Sarasota with two of our beloved temples desecrated with Nazi symbols and language, it's time to take back the power. And we can, because we are a strong community. Tonight, you'll hear from Stephanie Hausner, the Interim Director of the Israel Action Network. I've had the privilege of working with Stephanie over the years, and I'm really proud to have her here for you. Please know this webinar is being recorded, and because we have such small numbers, we may be able to do Q&A during the presentation, but you can ask at any time in the chat. Please do so that you don't forget. So let me introduce Stephanie for you. Stephanie Hausner is currently the Interim Director for the Israel Action Network at the Jewish Federations of North America. Stephanie oversees all of IAN's campus, community, and legislative work and speaks frequently at federations and conferences across the country. She is the main point of contact for federations and JCRCs on Israel, BDS, delegitimization, and anti-Semitism issues. Stephanie has over a decade of experience working in the federation system in various capacities, including community relations, young leadership, synagogue engagement, and Jewish education, most recently at the Jewish Federations of Northern New Jersey. Stephanie recently completed 2 terms serving as an elected councilwoman in Clarkstown, New York. She was named one of Rockland County's 40 under 40 in 2010, and in 2013 was included in the New York Jewish Week's 36 under 36. Stephanie graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a degree in international relations. Stephanie, all yours.
Thank you, Jessie. And I should say I travel frequently via Zoom to conferences and communities across the country. So tonight we're going to kind of dig in and talk a little bit about campus life, what you should know, and just to get like a little sense of the virtual room. Who has a student that's currently on campus? I guess raise hands. Who has a student that's in high school that will be going to campus soon? Okay, cool. And I know we have a few people that we don't see their screens. So we'll just assume maybe it's the same kind of percentages. So tonight we're gonna talk a little about Jewish students in general. What are some of the tense moments on campus that we're seeing, a little bit of how to deal with those if they come up for your child, and then some resources. And I would say that just to center where we are is that the Israel Action Network is part of the Jewish Federation system. That's why I changed my background to fit in with Andrea and Jessie's as we were starting off this call. So we are a department of Jewish Federations of North America, and we're here to serve the Federation system. And one of the benefits of the Federation system is that we have a federation in Sarasota. We have 146 Jewish federations across the United States and Canada. We also have about 300 network communities, which are smaller Jewish communities. And so I like to say we have the best ground game out of any Jewish organization. And when it comes to campus issues, there are about 400 Hillels on college campuses across the country, a little less in terms of Chabad's. But we're in so many communities and we're able to help people. So I always just kind of want to start there that we're a resource that could be used, not just in local issues, but we have relationships across the country. And of course, we practiced how to get onto the share screen, and now it's not coming up. So give me 1 second and I will pull up the screen. Okay, here we go. Start with a little humor. I thought that the slide might help. We'll see it in 1 second. And in the chat box, you can put now, and you can kind of keep them going, and I'll monitor them as we're talking. What are your main concerns about either your child on the campus right now or going to a campus? And just, it could be a couple of thoughts, it could be a sentence, just to get a sense of what some of the things are that you're hoping we cover tonight, and then I will make sure to hit as many of them as possible. So what's life like for Jewish students? And I know when I first went to college, my grandma was like, oh, the Hillel building. And I was like, you had Hillel when you were in college, right? And so sometimes we think of these structures in the way when we were there. And even I have 3 younger brothers, which I might refer to multiple times during this presentation, because I feel like it helps to personalize some of these experiences. But 3 younger brothers, we all had very different Jewish life on campus. And I say that because there's no one size fits all. And you're a student, and I know a couple of you were talking as you were coming on the call about your kids going to a Hillel program this week. And so it's great. Not every student's going to find Hillel immediately. And so I'm just putting that out there because it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It doesn't mean that Hillel's doing anything wrong. It just takes a little while for Jewish students to connect sometimes. So we know that Jewish students are more diverse than ever before. They're coming many times from households with 1 Jewish parent. There are more Jews of color in today's representing on college campuses than ever before, which is also, especially as we're dealing with racial justice issues as a country right now, obviously complicates and creates different environments. There are more opportunities to connect Jewishly, which I wrote twice because it's that important. And there's an increase of anti-Semitic instances. And what I mean is more opportunities to connect is that there's Hillel and there's Chabad, but there are also, and we'll get to this later, there are at least 30 Jewish organizations that do some kind of work on college campuses. And so there are different ways that Jewish students connect. But also it could be through, and this is a new model that Hillel's been using, through outside of buildings, right? And so they're connecting in different ways. So a little bit about millennials and their connection to Israel, because I think it helps frame the conversation. I have 2 slides. This is from 2016. It's a Pew study. The next one's from 2019. But this one's a little easier to read, so I figured we'd start here. So the way in which they view this question really just shows generational support for Israel. And the question they used to frame was, do you support Israel, or do you side or empathize with them, sympathize with them, Israel, or the Palestinians? And for a long time, there was pushback to Pew saying, like, that's not the same question, right? But using that question, right, we see that there's a generational shift in the millennial generation, born after 1980. Now, we're talking now, this current college students are actually Generation Z, but have not been part of a Pew study yet. However, this new Pew study, which was just taken in 2019, but maybe it's easier to read than I thought, does start with Generation Z, right? This ages 18 to 29. So it's a little bit of a mix of Generation Z and millennial generation. They changed the way they ask the questions. And so now they ask, do you have a favorable view of Palestinians or Israelis? The people, and then the government. And so you'll see the similar trends are keeping up, in that there's much more of a sympathy amongst the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis, and support and sympathizing is pretty similar for younger generation, 18 to 29, whereas it really is much more distant for certainly the greatest generation and those over 65. There are a lot of, this also kind of aligns itself with political leanings. We're gonna actually do, and I'll do my first plug for this, we're gonna do a regional training program with the South Florida federations, and we're going to delve much deeper into this, but I wanted to bring it up because part of the reason there are generational issues, and I think it's important to understand, is that this generation of college students, those in college right now, are from a post 9/11 generation, or in Israel terms, they're a post Oslo generation. And so they don't remember times when Israel was coming together necessarily for peace, right? There have been several peace opportunities. There was a Kerry plan, right? But for really intensely, where there was this desire for peace, they just remember in their lifetime several Gaza campaigns and several wars. And so it shapes their view in a large way of how they view Israel, and especially how they view the Israeli government. The last few years and the relationship between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration has made that even stronger, as younger generation tend to be pretty vocal against President Trump. So, and the older generations we see, certainly people who remember the Six-Day War, remember when Israel might no longer have existed. And for those of my grandparents' time that don't remember when Israel was created, certainly have a deeper connection. And so I point that out because I think it shows kind of the frame of where we're looking. So what are some campus trends? Students for Justice in Palestine is the leading pro-BDS, and we're going to define BDS, but BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, the leading group on campus since really 2001, when the first chapter started at UC Berkeley. They've kind of doubled down on this idea of co-opting, and it's come up a lot in the last month or so, even more, co-opting on a strategy of a broader protest movement, right? So the idea is that bringing their issues and their narrative into any kind of broad protest. And we've seen this a little bit with Black Lives Matter protests over the last few months, where we've seen a few where Students for Justice in Palestine or other pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel groups have tried to take over pieces of this. This happened at DePaul University in the Chicago area, where Black Lives Matter was having, it was right after George Floyd was murdered, Black Lives Matter was having a protest. Students for Justice in Palestine started sending out their own invites to the protest and saying that this was not just about racial justice and George Floyd, but it was also about the Palestinian people. And the Jewish community said to the leaders of the Black community, we want to stand with you, but this is not about Israel, right? And we're only going to stand with you if you recognize that this is not about Israel. And so they actually did, and they kind of won that little fight. And someone just wrote they did that with the women's marches too. Yes, very true, excellent example. And so that takes on a life of its own on college campuses. This also aligns with intersectionality, right? With the idea that we have this kind of systems of oppression and how power dynamics play. And this is something that's a weird kind of generational issue too, in that there's a lot of, amongst younger people, the idea of power and privilege. And we as Jews in society in America tend to have power and privilege, or at least perceived power and privilege. Now, for some, that's really hard to wrap your head around, but it's certainly kind of the topic and language that we hear a lot amongst college students. We see a growing movement of divestment from not just Israel, but from fossil fuel company and private prisons. We often, when we see divestment efforts from fossil fuels and private prisons, usually that means that Israel is close behind. I already mentioned Black Lives Matter. There's a group called Jewish Voice for Peace, which is very small, actually. Their budget's less than $3 million. They have less than 100,000 activists nationwide, but they're very loud and vocal, and they come to this space as the leading Jewish pro-BDS organization. And they actually, about 1.5 years ago, said that they were anti-Zionist, which has been helpful to us because it's been a way for us, not just Federation, but Federation, ADL, AJC, our other partners, to kind of to show that they don't speak for the Jewish community. but they are certainly gaining a little bit of presence on campus and sometimes aligning with other student groups. We do see broad coalitions approach Israel activists. I do want to say one thing about J Street U, because I know it gets talked about a lot. It has very different, it's a national group, but has very different chapters on different universities. So on many universities, they will help defeat BDS resolutions. On a few, they haven't been as active and have aligned themselves more with other groups. We're seeing kind of stealth campaigns. The idea of votes on Jewish holidays has been going on for several years now, but Passover tends to be a particular time of year when you're going to see a lot of anti-Israel activity on college campuses. It also happens to be around the time of Easter, and so they're banking on the fact that Jewish students and maybe Christian students who support Israel might be off campus. Disruptions. And this will be interesting to see how this, because this has morphed a little in this Zoom world, is that we were seeing anytime there was like a pro-Israel speaker or an Israeli speaker speaking on a college campus, that we'd have, and this is not in every campus, but it happens a decent amount. It happens a lot in the California system, and it's happened quite a bit in the Chicago area, is there Students for Justice Palestine will come in, they'll chant, sometimes stop the talk, and not allow it to continue. We've seen die-ins, not just around Israel, but those kind of like activist techniques are ones that we're seeing more in a younger generation. Now on Zoom, the idea of Zoom bombing is something that we're particularly worried about in terms of like Hillel programming, and the Secure Community Network, who we work with, and the Federation I know worked with, especially recently, has been doing training programs and helping, as has the ADL, on how to fix your Zoom so that you don't have those problems. Lists of progressive demands linking anti-Israel activity with other progressive issues. And this has been a particularly difficult topic, where it's about two different ways it plays out. One is that we're demanding equal pay, and like you could name 10 different issues and they'll throw BDS on. We saw that a lot with the Women's March. So, delegitimization of Israel. What are we talking about? So a global campaign to demonize and isolate Israel. It's really creating a world where Israel no longer exists as a Jewish and democratic state. And so to have 193 countries in the United Nations and Israel over here. And there are lots of ways that this plays out. And so how does it play out specifically on campus? How it plays out on campus. This is from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The sign, which is maybe a little difficult to read, maybe not. This was a student government meeting in which the student government decided to pass a resolution defining anti-Semitism, and they didn't include Jewish students in the process. And they declared that anti-Zionism was not anti-Semitism. And so the Jewish students spoke up and said, you don't get to determine what anti-Semitism is. We determine what anti-Semitism is as Jewish students at this university. And Hillel and Chabad and AEPI and every other campus group got together and all worked on this together, which I think one of the benefits we see sometimes when things get rough on college campus is that the Jewish community really does come together. But what does BDS look like on college campuses? So my favorite is on the left, Sabra hummus boycott. This one baffles me for lots of reasons. One, Sabra hummus is owned by Pepsi company, PepsiCo, which is based in White Plains in New York, and they're manufactured in Northern Virginia. So Sabra hummus is not actually, at this point, an Israeli company. But what we see on a lot of college campuses is they'll start, it'll be a boycott Sabra hummus. They'll go to the administration and tell them they want Sabra hummus off the shelves. And so what normally happens is sometimes they win, it comes off the shelves in the dining hall or wherever else for like 2 days. Jewish students start handing out hummus on the campus, and then they bring Sabra hummus back, and maybe they bring back Tribe or another brand with it. you'll see here, you see San Diego, divest for Palestine, vote for justice. I use this flyer because it also highlighting the word justice, right? There's a lot of language of human rights that's used in these campaigns. And part of that is because it's a way to get people to kind of buy in, right? Using language, and I've had conversations with a lot of very progressive young people, college students just out of college. And I've started to talk, because I just talk about Israel, like everywhere I go, right? So I will just happen to mention something. I'll be like, oh, I bought these in Israel. Oh, you've been to Israel? Yeah, of course I've been to Israel, right? And we'll have this conversation, and we'll be like, well, I really side with the Palestinians. And I said, well, I support Palestinian. What do you mean? Like, what does that mean? And she said, well, I've just heard a lot of bad things about Israel, and I'm for justice, and so I side with the Palestinians. And a lot of times, and this is why we often say to people, not every college student, especially college students who support a BDS resolution, don't think Israel should exist, are anti-Israel. A lot of them are not educated and really don't know what they're talking about. And so once you kind of pry, and we're going to get into kind of the prying in a little bit, but once you kind of pry into the conversation, you realize it's a little deeper, or it's not very deep in terms of their support. We see mock apartheid walls. They're usually not very big. They don't get a lot of attention. We encourage students actually to kind of ignore them, and usually they disappear pretty quickly. Social media campaigns, you'll see kind of different hashtags. This will probably be even more popular this year now that most students are somewhat virtual, is that we'll start seeing even student council elections and things like that playing out virtually. We did see sometimes that might lead to cyberbullying situations where we had at UC, now I'm gonna, USC, sorry, get confused sometimes with these California schools, they have lots of issues, where a vice president of their student government had to resign. She was facing a lot of pressure and cyberbullying around her position as a Zionist and not being the right person for the time. This isn't very common, but it's certainly something that happened. Now, what about the Zionism piece? So we're seeing a very large rise in anti-Zionism and the normalizing of anti-Semitism. People saying, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just don't like Israel. I don't think Israel should exist. Or even from Jewish students, Israel just has no value to me. It's not important. And it's a very hard thing, I think, especially probably for Jewish young people. I mean, it's a hard thing for me to hear. It's a hard thing for Jewish young people who grew up within the Federation, JCC camp, right? Who Israel is a very important place in their heart, and for them to understand where their peers are coming from on this. And so we have a few pieces that might be helpful, right? And we do think anti-Zionism is a kind of modern day, this is a quote from Abba Eban, that classical anti-Semitism denies the rights of Jews as citizens within society, and anti-Zionism denies the equal rights of Jewish people to its lawful sovereignty within the community of nations, right? And that really gets to the heart of what the issue that we're seeing now. So when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism, right? When you deny the existence of a Jewish state, but no other state, and its right to express its identity, using Holocaust and Nazi imagery. We saw this also a little bit with some of the COVID protests, demonizing Israel and Jewish citizens, just one-sided, right? Not placing any blame on Palestinians. Claims, and this is a very college campus piece, that colonialists are invaders of the land. There's not a real thought out understanding of the history of, or not a lot of background on the history of the Israeli-Arab conflict, or even the foundation of the state of Israel. And so we even had a student this summer who was part of our Changemakers program that Federation was running, and said, I just don't understand why Israel took over Palestine. And I did a kind of quick overview of Israeli history and talking about British mandated Palestine and trying to explain how the maps worked and all of that. And we could do that in another presentation. But I think part of it is that these are accusations that people hear. And so in addition to some of the things we're going to talk about is being able to provide some resources for students who want to delve a little bit deeper. So, and we have a one-pager on this, so we'll send around. Here's another issue that we'll probably face on campus, and we're going to face everywhere, probably over the next 2 months, even more so: political partisanship and polarization. Right now, one of the issues that we've had in this space, in the BDS space, over the last couple of years, has been the relationship between Israel and the United States government, and the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, and how that is portrayed in people that don't like Donald Trump. And so even the embassy move to Jerusalem, which is something that totally had bipartisan support, right, for decades, is thing most Jews agree that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem, was something that some people didn't think was positive. Whether it's, how it happened or anything like that. But because right now, and especially amongst younger people, that there's like a Midas touch effect for some of anything Donald Trump touches is therefore bad. We see that a lot, particularly in progressive spaces, where even things that previously people might have thought were fine, what Israel was doing, are now looked at in a different way because of that connection. But, so I feel like I scared everyone, and I don't want to. And so this is my way of saying, yes, those are bad things that happen on college campus and people need to be ready for them. But the positive side is, and this is actually from UF, I think, or Florida State. And the good thing is there are actually more pro-Israel activities going on and more vibrant Jewish life happening on college campuses now than ever before. And so I'm showing that as a way to say, yeah, sometimes it gets kind of bad on college campuses, but most of the time, there's a lot to do and a lot of celebration of Jewish life. And sometimes the campuses, actually this is most of the time, most of the campuses who have had the worst BDS or anti-Semitic activity on their campus have the most thriving Jewish communities and some of the strongest Hillels. And so it's probably because of that they have BDS on campus, but there's something to see for that. So who else are in this campus space, right, that you need to be thinking about? Right, we have professor issues occasionally, classroom challenges, academic associations, curriculum. I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly because administrators. One of the things that we're working on and federations have been very active in is working with college, and Hillel is nationally going to begin an effort on this, is to encourage colleges and universities to adopt meaningful policies that include anti-Semitism, on tolerance on campus. And so what we found is that a lot of administrators don't quite understand what anti-Semitism is, and having them think about whether their diversity and inclusion offices include Jews, include Jewish students, the complaints of Jewish students, and how they deal with that on campus, and giving them the tools is something that we've been working with federations to help provide to college administrators. So who's on campus? What does a campus ecosystem look like, right? You have students, you have grad students, professors, boards of trustees, administrators, Hillel, Chabad. I mentioned other campus groups. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second, and community. And we at IN view our role, we have a close relationship, we call it the core relationship, with Hillel International and the Israel on Campus Coalition. The Israel on Campus Coalition is a group that is an umbrella for about 25 different campus-based Israel organizations. So we have regular calls, so we know what's going on college campuses. And then our role is to then reach out to the federations and say, by the way, we just heard of this situation. So today we had an issue at Mount Holyoke. So we just heard of this situation at Mount Holyoke, so we called the Boston Federation, right? And part of that is to make sure that we as a community can help support the Federation. So I say that because I know not everyone's kids are gonna go to school in Florida, and I want you to know that you feel supported by this network, even so. So this kind of shows a little bit of, and I made this map for something else, but I think it shows a similar point, right? We at IAN work with a lot of these different groups, and we're able to kind of bring their resources forth, but it also shows you the sheer number of different groups that we're talking about on college campuses. And resources. So the first resource that I'm providing is, it's from our colleagues at the Chicago Federation. It is called the Lexicon, and it's basically a dictionary and encyclopedia of terms around Israel that might be helpful, because I know sometimes people get embarrassed, like I don't know what annexation means or how it relates to settlements. And so it's like a quick kind of dictionary. I wrote Jessie because she can be kind of your first stop if there's a question, and she'll help determine if she should call me or should call a colleague in another city, depending on the issue. If there's an issue of safety, then we encourage you to call SCAN, or maybe Jessie and then SCAN. They are like kind of the Jewish Homeland Security is how I phrase it, but they have a special relationship and now have a whole campus security team that is working to make sure that Jewish students are safe and secure on college campuses. And particularly they work with Hillel Chabad and Jewish fraternities and sororities, IAN, and federations, wherever you are. So now, one of the, and this is gonna be, I'm not like saying, oh, we need to do a listening exercise right now, but I find that one of the challenges we have as a community is that we, is thinking about when we hear difficult information, how we handle it. And I think one of the things that we see often is that our younger generation uses words and language that we might not use, right? College students often will say the word occupation to describe political situation, whereas we might say, or they'll say Palestine to describe the West Bank. And sometimes it's hard for people to hear words that are polarizing to them. And so one of the things, and this actually came from a student presentation, but I thought I would share it with you, because we really focus on how do you talk to your neighbor, right? How do you talk to your roommate? How do you talk to someone? We're not preparing students for debates on campus, because in the whole, they're not happening, right? It used to be like, we need to prepare our students to debate on college campuses because that's where these conversations around Israel are happening and they need to be able to debate. The problem is that the anti-Israel students do not, they refuse to normalize relationships many times. And so there are no debates, there are no conversations. So instead, we need to talk to people that don't disagree with us, but who just might not understand, right? And so these are kind of some of our active listening questions to think about in terms of when someone says, oh, Israel's an apartheid state. What leads you to say that? Why do you think that? And sometimes we kind of go in with an aggressive tone and really thinking about how do we get to the base of what they're saying. And so I think one of the things I would take away is to talk to like your kids about what they're hearing, right? What they're hearing on campus. Is this something that's even going on? And if they're hearing things, like what kind of tools would be helpful for them, but are they even having, right, the conversations? And so we have this like role play activity, right? Where you're walking with a friend and they're saying, how can you support Israel? It's a racist state, right? And it's a student of color saying Israel is a racist state, right? How do you have that conversation, right? And some of those things are some of the tools that we work on. And thinking back, and one of the most important pieces is how do we convey our Israel story? Like, how is Israel important to us? And that's going to change depending on who the person is. right? And for us, we're all going to have something different that explains why we love Israel, why we support Israel, how it's important. But utilizing that in terms of kind of setting our personal narrative is something that we find very helpful, and something also that parents can really talk to their children about, right? Like, how do we as a family connect to Israel? Why is it important to us? Because that's something that we want it to not just be something that they're reading about and something that they know every fact about, but something that's also like in their kishkas, and like that love is deep, and that they feel connected, and they feel connected. This is part of their kind of a Jewish experience. So I'm going to look at the questions, and we can spend like more time on them. But that was kind of like, I wanted to give you a taste of some of the things we're seeing, some of the things we're talking to students about. And now we will leave. I'll stop sharing the screen and open it up for questions. And I actually should say, well, I'll open it up. We can all see each other better. A couple of other things that I tell parents a lot is that when I say Jesse's your first call, I mean it, or the Hillel director could be your first call too, is that a lot of times there's like this, we need to call the university, there's like all this stuff is going on, and sometimes there are things happening behind the scenes that not everyone knows about. And so part of the reason why we encourage people to call either the Hillel or the Federation is to get a better sense of what some of those puzzle pieces might be. We had an issue at the University of Michigan that was pretty well known a few years ago, so some of you might be familiar with it, where there were 3 issues actually, and I'll use this, I think it's a good case study, and maybe we'll get some questions in the meantime. Is one, there was a professor who refused to write a study abroad letter recommendation for a student because they were studying abroad, they wanted to study abroad in Israel. Then there was a cartoon, a political cartoon of Prime Minister Netanyahu that was likened him to a Nazi. It was completely inappropriate and anti-Semitic. And then there was a grad student who refused to write a study abroad letter, right? And all these incidents happened within a 3-week period, and BDS came to campus again for the 10th time in 11 years. So what happened? And so one of the things that we did was we worked with the Detroit Federation, we worked with the Ann Arbor Federation, the JCRC in Detroit, and some of the alumni from across the country who were part of our federation system to all kind of put together a list of things that we were asking, right, demands, I guess, from the university, right, in terms of having a policy for study abroad letters, in terms of having some kind of process for how some of these items are viewed, because it was a seminar that all freshmen are required to, right? And we put together some of these issues because we said there was a campus climate issue on campus. It wasn't just about these couple of incidences, but clearly when so many instances happen over the course of a very short time, Jewish students start to feel unsafe on campus, or they start to feel distracted from their studies and feel like they're there, you know, having to deal with all these other pieces. And because we were able to speak with one voice, like we were able to move things along quite quicker, and they created a system in place for study abroad. And so now that would not happen under their current new policy, and started working towards doing trainings around anti-Semitism on campus. Question about UCF. There have been some issues at UCF. Really 2 years ago, I think, was the last time that we had a problem there. I mean, I think it was a BDS resolution. Sometimes though, I get confused between UCF and USF. So I apologize, but I know that we also had an issue where there was a resolution when the embassy was moved. I mentioned that before. There was a resolution when the embassy was moved against the embassy being moved. And that school, every time there's like a particular moment, so we kind of anticipate there could be a resolution against the UAE Israeli peace agreement, because every time Israel's in the news about something, there seems to be an anti that resolution. It hasn't necessarily passed every time, but it's something we've seen from activists within the Student Senate. What if students want to display a flag? Sharon, can you say more about what you mean?
I just remember visiting a few years back, Boston area and the Northeastern campus. Like from the metro or the train line, you could see outside the building, and there was like a Palestinian flag, like outside the window. So I was just curious, you know, how does that, what if a student wants to hang a flag in their dorm room, you know, an Israeli, flag? Yeah, Israeli flag or a Palestinian flag. Like, I mean, I don't know. What if that happens, and how do you handle that?
So it's interesting. I did say I was going to probably end up mentioning my brothers again at some point. So my brother had a roommate his freshman year that put up a Palestinian flag. So my brother put up a bigger Israeli flag. And that kind of, in some ways, de-escalated in a very strange way the situation, because then they actually said, you know what, like, okay, let's have a conversation, right? We're not going to have like a flag war. And my brother said, I'm putting up an Israeli flag because I want you to understand why it's important to me. And then they had a conversation about it, and both flags stayed up for that semester, and then they both found new roommates. But I would say that, you know, a flag issue, like putting up an Israeli flag shouldn't be an issue. If it is an issue, then we have to like deal with that at that moment in time. We have seen, I think it was Kent State. And I try to remember all these issues, and sometimes I might mix up which one, but Kent State, I think, where there was a Golda Meir quote in a, I don't know, like a Jewish, it was not a Jewish, it was just like a student union, and it had like women leaders quotes. And so they had this Golda Meir quote, and I don't even remember what the quote was, but they were redoing the student union, and all of a sudden, like the Palestinian activists, and they have a large Muslim community there, started reacting to this Golda Meir quote. And it became kind of like this fight back and forth, because it was a symbol, right? This symbol of Israel, and part of it, and they ended up winning the kind of fight. But it is something that sometimes these symbols take on lives of their own. But I would say a lot of these are individual issues, and certainly a student has a right, their freedom of speech, to hang their flag in their dorm room. Jesse posed a question. We're not very religious, and my son hasn't been to Israel. He won't be in the pro-Israel crowd. Will any of this affect him? So I'm going to handle it, answer this in a couple of different ways. One, when I went to college, I had not been to Israel. I was supposed to, and I say that because, well, for lots of reasons, but I was supposed to go on USY pilgrimage, youth group, and the second Antifada broke out, and it was one of the few times in the history that they've canceled the USY pilgrimage. And so what was supposed to be my summer between junior and senior year of college didn't quite happen that way. And so I went to college, never been to Israel, and I thought that meant that, and I very quickly got involved in Hillel, and we had David Broza come to campus my second month of school. I didn't know who David Broza was, but my friends told me that he was the Israeli Bruce Springsteen. And since I grew up on the border of New Jersey, I thought that was a big deal. So I helped flyer for this David Broza concert. And I started getting involved in the Israel group on campus. And then I said to them, listen, I've never been to Israel. I don't really think I should be here. I don't know if I have a voice in this. I know I'm Jewish. Israel's important to me, but I've never been there. And I think that it is sometimes a tension that especially Jewish college students feel sometimes that they're on the front lines. And I think oftentimes we as a community treat them that way, that they are Israel's ambassadors or shlichim, or some people even say the boots on the ground on college campuses. And they have to defend Israel and know how to defend Israel at all costs. And they have, of course, have to have been to Israel to do that. And I think this is where we, it's not true, right? It's thinking about how we connect students, young people, really everyone in our community to Israel, even if they've never been, right? So sometimes it's sharing with them experiences of others who have been to Israel, right? Sharing mission or trips with the Federation or with synagogues or things like that. Sometimes it's through shlichim in the community or an Israeli family in the community and experiences they've had with them. Sometimes it's over food. So I think that's something too, is like making sure that we give opportunities as a community for students to connect, but also that we as parents, right, give opportunities at home for whether it's through books or reading. I'm always like, we should start it with PJ Library and make sure that we're reading Israeli stories in PJ Library so that our like 3 and 4-year-olds feel connected to Israel. And I think, you know, some people think that's a great idea and some people think maybe not, but you know, I think that part of it is talking about Israel and figuring out how they can be proud of Israel and create an Israel story that might not have involved being there. And I would say on the like not religious front is that most of the students who get involved in some kind of Jewish life don't necessarily come from religious families. And there are lots of different ways through social action, through fraternity, sorority, different ways to connect Jewishly on campus. What would I recommend for the student who wants to have a connection to Jewish community but doesn't know how or what to get involved on campus? So I think it depends on the student. And this should be when I mention my not every Jewish student's the same piece, and it might go back to my brother's story a little bit, in that I'm an activist. Like my passion is politics. And so when someone handed me a quarter sheet on the quad when I was a college student, and that I mentioned the second Intifada, and the quarter sheet said that Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time, was a war criminal, like hell I reacted, right? Like I knew the student that was handing it to me and I was like, what are you talking about? And I went back and he had like all this information on it, and I think it might've been a little bit before the Googling for everything, but I went back and I did a little bit of research on this, and I came back more educated on it and really more like fiery in my activism. That doesn't happen to everyone, and not everyone wants to fight, and not everyone wants to get engaged on the political level. And so my brother with the like roommate with the Palestinian Israeli flag wasn't involved. He went to GW, which is a very political campus. He wasn't involved in politics at all, but like that was his quiet way of engaging. And he was involved in Hillel and like would show up to Friday night services when there was a cute girl who was also going to Friday night services. And that was kind of like what got him in. And then he was like, oh, the food's pretty good. I guess I'll keep on coming. Like literally direct quote. And so I think sometimes that's what it takes. But also oftentimes it's just having a friend to go with, right? No one wants to do anything alone. And so I think having them think of something they could do with someone else, and it might even be a non-Jewish friend, and something that's like a very easy opportunity to delve into is a way to get them in. The other piece is birthright. And so right now that's not an option at this moment in time for American students, but it will be soon. And Birthright is already starting to figure out how do we retool in this new environment. And I think they're working on some models with Canadians who are a little bit less of a coronavirus problem right now. But thinking about engaging them in other ways in the Jewish community or through Birthright once they can go to Israel on that trip. Because even if they've been before, having that kind of group experience trip or that Birthright trip is a very unique experience that they could have. So I do highly recommend that. But it might take them 3 years to find Hillel, or it might take them, I had a colleague whose brother went to University of Michigan and he wanted nothing to do with Jewish life until there was a BDS issue on his college campus. And then he said, okay, I need to be involved because they're starting to criticize Jews and I feel like I need to be in this space. And then most college students are not going to experience BDS on their college. It's you know, probability wise, mostly occurs at Big Ten schools, and some other smatterings across the country, some of them in Florida. But, you know, for most, it's not going to be something that they have to deal with on a daily basis. They may hear some things from friends. They may hear from a professor in a Middle Eastern studies class. And so that they should be prepared. But when I think of students being prepared, the most important thing I think is that they feel supported both by their family, by their home community. I've spoken to a lot of rabbis who spend a lot of time with college students, talking to them and helping them through some of these difficulties on campus. And that they also feel like they can speak from a place of pride, right? I don't think every college student or every high school student or really every adult needs to know every fact there is to know about Israel, about Israeli history, about Israeli peace agreements. But we have to feel some kind of pride in Israel, in being Jewish, to be able to speak out. And so that's really the most important. And I think what we're seeing a lot more now is less so attacks on Israel and more so attacks, just blatant anti-Semitism. And I think having Jewish students have pride in their Jewish identity helps to deal with a lot of that anti-Semitism on campus too. Neo-Nazi clubs on campus. So, interesting question, because last week there was at Arizona State University is the only one I'm aware of in which they're not a neo-Nazi club. I think they call themselves a fascist something or other, but there were Nazi flyers on campus. We have seen over the last year or so white supremacist efforts on campus. Interestingly enough, we've seen on some campuses Jewish students, or really we've seen posters that say white supremacy equals Zionism equals racism. And then on that same campus, white supremacists have flyered attacking Jewish students. There have been some flyering where they pretend they're Black Lives Matter. And that was scanned, and the ADL and law enforcement has actually proven that it was white supremacist flyers, not Black Lives Matter, but they were made to look like Black Lives Matter, trying to say that Jewish students were the ultimate white supremacy in the top 1%. And so that's, I think, the biggest struggle about being a Jewish student on campus right now, is that you're in the cross section. It might be the biggest struggle being a Jew in America right now, is this cross section of white supremacy and hate, and then, you know, hate from the left, hate from the right, and how it all kind of involves together in some weird ways. And we've seen where you have white supremacist quotes, like David Duke quotes from KKK, and then you align them with quotes from Omar Barghouti, who's one of the leaders of the BDS movement. And if you put their quotes next to each other, sometimes you really can't tell the difference. And that's a scary situation. And I would say that there are efforts, especially now, to divide Jewish community from other minority groups, particularly being led by white supremacists, which makes things difficult, or defining good Jews from bad Jews and who gets to make those decisions. And we've seen some of the more JVP, if not now, some groups that are a little bit outside of our kind of federation tent, aligning themselves with other groups, and those groups then saying we're going to use their definition of anti-Semitism, right? And so that they're taking a very small segment of the Jewish community and aligning themselves with this very small Jewish segment of the community, and then using that as a way to say, like, oh, I have Jewish friends, kind of thing. So we don't know how that's going to quite play out, because it is something that's a newer issue. It certainly hasn't happened in very many places. If students encounter anti-Semitism on campus, if it's a physical incident, they should call campus police immediately. And then they should call Hillel. If there is no Hillel on campus, then you can, and this is the last question, we'll move on. If there is no Hillel on campus, then I guess you could call Jesse is probably a good way to go, or you can reach out to us and we'll find out who the right person is. Oftentimes it's the Federation or JCRC who will kind of step in that situation. Also, I would call your security director. You have a security director, I would call them, and then they can help guide you through that incident as well. Even though it's not in your community, they'll be able to help with the campus police because they're part of a national network to do that. Because our SCAN security directors work very closely with campus police and other law enforcement on these issues. But I would say if it's physical, for sure, obviously 911 campus police is the first way to handle. And then if it's not physical and it's people saying, you know, making comments or it's something over time or being singled out, then that's a different situation. And then I would start with Hillel. And then see where that goes. And then I would reach out to Jesse and we can kind of figure it out from there. And the ADL for sure can be a resource. They're just not everywhere. And so that's kind of the benefit, I think, sometimes of Hillel and federations is that we're local to every community and certainly, especially when dealing with law enforcement, that becomes very helpful. Okay, so we'll wrap up. We went over a lot of stuff and I hope it was helpful. I hope it was a start to thinking about some of these issues. I hope it didn't scare people too much. And we are here to be a resource.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. You know, we really hope that you learned a little bit more about what your child might experience once they reach college, if they haven't already, and that you can support them even from afar. As Stephanie mentioned a few times, you can always reach out to me. We will be having a Jewish community security director starting in September. We are starting this month. And so he too will be a resource. And of course, if it has anything to do with Hillel, we have Sydney, who is here, and Andrea, who you all know very well and who your children know. So we're all here for you, and we're all in this together. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here and for telling us all of this information. There were some things in your presentation that I'd like to share with the group. So if you could send me some of those links, I'll make sure to send them off to all of you. Thank you again, Stephanie, and from all of us at the Jewish Federation, thank you and be well. Have a great evening. Bye, guys.